This is not a clickbait video. This is a story I am absolutely passionate about, and I've been wanting to tell it for about 6 years. It is a real life story. All the names that are mentioned, all the places that are mentioned, it is all historically factual. I have struggled to record this video because I know to do it justice I'd have to record in cemeteries, but I know without their beautiful final resting places I would not be doing this story much justice, or the men whose stories I'm trying to tell. All recordings have been done with the utmost respect for the people involved and their families. All of this started with a ghost. Let me set the scene. So it was Easter Day, so that was the 1st of April 2018. We were in a village called Finningley, walking around the duck pond with my son, his new pony, and my husband at the time. It was really early in the day because the traffic in that village is known to be awful, so it was 8 AM. We hadn't, on that particular morning, up until this point, seen another living soul. Because we were out for a walk and because it was Easter Day, my then husband ran in front of us, as you would do for a normal picture, turned around. There was myself leading my son's pony with my son on top riding, right next to the duck pond in Finningley, and he took a photograph. And we didn't think anything of it at all. He probably took several photographs in different settings around our little walk really early on in the morning. Again, just to point out, we didn't see anybody else. But when we got home and we had a look at the images, there was somebody in the background walking along the back of where we had been. So they were walking just where we had been, but along the side of the road. We would have seen them had they been there. Had we actually passed another human being, we would have said hello, good morning, happy Easter. We did not see this person. So when we got home, I got really curious. Like, what is this? What did we see? Surely to goodness, I know I saw something. There's a person in the picture that we hadn't seen in real life. So I googled Finningley ghost, ghosts of Finningley, and that was the very beginning of this story. So doing the research, 2 legends appeared. The first of all being a hermit who lived down the road at Lindholme Hall. Lindholme Hall is sat on a sandbank. It's a big country manor house, and it's in the middle of the peat fields, but legend has it that there used to be a hermit who lived there, and this hermit was also a ghost of Lindholme Willy. That's number 1. Number 2 is an airman who was seen at the Northern Radar. He's been seen at RAF Lindholme and subsequently HMP Lindholme. This is an airman with a Polish tongue, looking for his comrades, wanting to know where the mess is, seemingly lost in his flight suit, looking for his friends. But the really startling thing is that both of these ghosts are called Lindholme Willy. But wait, what? Google also provided me with some other information. On Thursday, the 23rd of July, 1987, a body was found on the Peat Moors. It was later proved that this body was in fact that of a young man who had fallen from a plane and died during World War II. At this point, absolutely nobody was going to be able to convince me that the legends, the sightings and the body were not all connected. The day after Easter Day, I stood in the rain looking down at this grave. I have no idea what forces of nature brought me here. At this point I had no confirmation if this grave was even that of the man from 1987 and the body found on the moors. I just knew it was too much of a coincidence not to be. So who was this man? Surely now, with modern DNA testing techniques, bodies shouldn't be unidentified. but in 1987 DNA was still in its infancy. And it turns out, after a subject data request from Doncaster coroners, that a fire destroyed all of the original autopsy details that they held. The only person who still holds a file on this case is the retired Detective Inspector Greenslade from South Yorkshire Police. He was the original investigating officer, and he was one of the ones that stood and watched over the bodies when they were found on the moor. So then, with no hard evidence, where exactly do you go next? Please do check out our video from Willem X Kid from 5 years ago. It's called Exploring Abandoned Haunted Moor, and it's where for the first time we came across the crash site of the plane W5557. It's where we saw the mound that had been dug out of the peat for the first time, and we walked across the moors to be able to find what was left of the plane, because there are still some actual pieces of plane there, and the most beautiful monument dedicated to the 4 men who died after that crash. The 26th and 27th of September 1941, the Polish crew of 305 Squadron undertook an operational flight to bomb Cologne and took off from Lindholme at 1927 hours. All appears to have gone without incident on the outbound journey and over the target area. Fog was over Lindholme in the early hours of the 27th of September 1941, and while it was clear air above 500 feet, below that fog was seriously affecting visibility. All of the aircraft returning to Lindholme were short on fuel. Having flown back into the general area of Lindholme Airfield, the crew lowered their undercarriage and were making an approach to land when it was thought that the pilot either misjudged the height of the aircraft was flying at, or it had run out of fuel and the pilot was attempting a forced landing. The aircraft struck trees and then crashed here on Hatfield Moor, just short of the airfield at 01:30 hours. Sadly, 3 members of the Polish crew were killed in the crash, and a 4th died just over 24 hours later in hospital at Doncaster Royal Infirmary. Legend around here has always had it that Buzzco, the pilot of this crash, was in fact Lindholme Willy, and the body that was found on the peat moors. But it takes a really tall tale to believe that he was identified during the crash, taken all the way with his comrades to Newark Cemetery to be buried, and then somebody dug him up, took him out in a plane, and then dropped him again from the sky. I don't think anybody can believe that, so I think that we can definitely strike Buzzco off the list. At this point in my history knowledge, well, it kind of ran out. I needed help. I needed a Polish war historian, and so in steps my friend Neville Bugard. So let's talk about coincidences. I saw the ghost, if it was a ghost, on the 1st of April 2018. Neville mentioned to me that that day was the 100-year anniversary of the RAF. So not only is Easton known for the Dead Rising, but it was 100 years exactly since the RAF was formed. Neville obviously thought I was crazy, but after many years studying the Polish squadrons, especially for him Squadron 304, he was just a little curious and, well, a little hesitantly he started his own bit of research. The hesitation didn't take too long, nor did the coincidences stop coming. What we found out next was absolutely mind-blowing. If you take all of the known personnel from 305 Squadron and all of the known planes that were in service within this squadron, absolutely every single personnel plane is accounted for during World War II. All except one. Now, as we know, Stanislaw Barstow was on the original plane, and that is the crash site there. That is the island in the peat moors of the original crash site. He went up again on another bombing mission in a plane that was named after the original plane that crashed in May 1942. So, another coincidence? This is the only plane from the entire of 305 Squadron that doesn't have a known ending. It was presumed missing at sea, just presumed. They know it had gone out, it had done its mission, it had dropped its bombs and it was returning home, and from there it got in a dogfight and it was never seen or heard from again. This was just 8 months after Stanislaw Barsdow's first crash here. So now we're left with two very important directions to go in. We've got the body, and how did it fall out of the plane? The body was dug out of 6 foot of peat. He had hit the ground with such force he was likely to have suffocated due to dying from impact. He had spinal fractures to his legs, very commonly associated with falls from height. And most importantly, he was wearing a UK issue RAF bomber jacket, as was issued to all of the Polish forces serving in the UK in the Second World War. Most interestingly though, his skeletal features were feminine and smaller than a standard UK RAF personnel of the time. Now, for the sake of geography, I want to explain where the crash site is, and I want to explain where the runway is, just to give you an idea of where things actually happened and are in relation to each other. So the crash site is that big mound of trees in front there that has been cut out of the peat. It's still got quite a few trees on top, some silver birch over there. So that is in direct relation to the flight path from Germany, which is over there. In less than a mile in that direction, behind those trees over there, is the bottom end of the old runway. If you look over there, directly in front, where there's a little bit of water on show, that is where the body of the airman was found. He was on the same trajectory. He was also in the same place of somebody coming into land. Also, to give you an idea of how busy the skies were at the time, we are in direct flight paths as well of some other RAF bases. So this was RAF Lindholme. Down the road we've got RAF Sandtoft, we've also got RAF Finningley, and at the time there was also RAF Burcoat. In this particular era, it was not uncommon at all to have so many different nationalities in the skies. There were obviously the Germans, but stationed around here we also had Canadians, New Zealand, obviously the Polish, and then the UK as well. But the only ones who wore this flight jacket were UK Air Force and Polish Air Force. So how does a body fall out of a plane? For that, we need to look at another deadly crash at RAF Lindholme. I am now standing on the only bit of runway that is left at RAF Lindholme. As you can see, this is the very tail end of the runway, which would have stretched out all over the fields over there. So, why this is important to the story is, from RAF Sandtoft during World War II, a Halifax bomber took off and immediately got into difficulty. The ground crew here at Lindholme saw that this plane had got into difficulty and flagged him down. So he would have come down over there in the direction of the end of the runway, and he would have come over here in this direction. Now, at the end of this runway, during World War II, was a bomb store over there. There's also a house that you might just be able to see in the distance. Unfortunately, the Halifax bomber ended up going straight through the bomb store, straight into the house, and killing Doncaster's only civilian casualties of World War II, Mr. and Mrs. Hayth. They have their own Commonwealth war grave, and they are buried in Hatfield Cemetery. Why this is important to our story is the gentleman that survived this crash was the rear gunner. So Halifax bombers and Wellington bombers are obviously very different, but they also have some similar design features. The design feature of the rear gunner is that their chairs rotate and tilt. So when you're in a position where you probably think that you're going to crash, what you can do is rotate your chair and fall out of the plane backwards. The rear gunner of this Halifax bomber did that, and he was the only one to survive. When we've looked back through the archives, the only people that tend to have survived Wellington bomber crashes and Halifax bomber crashes are the rear gunners. So why do we think our Wellington bomber made it back to the moors? I believe the answer to this question lies with 305 Squadron's mascot, a little Lakeland Terrier dog called Ciapek. He was their little mascot, little doggy that used to go on their bombing missions with them, and in total he went on 9 runs dropping bombs over Germany. He wore a collar with the 305 logo sewn into it, and also for every bombing mission that was completed, the crews of the planes carved a little bomb to add to his collar like a little trinket, and in total, by the time of his final flight, he had 9 of these attachments. However, Ciapek's last plane was lost at sea. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? He himself was found on the Lincolnshire coast. He was found on a beach in Lincolnshire, and then after that he was brought back home here to his base at Lindholme. So for argument's sake, let's just imagine this scenario. You know your plane is in trouble. You know your plane is most likely going to crash. You have been on a bombing raid over Germany, you're flying back home over the sea, but you know there's every chance you're not going to make it back. Isn't it possible, if your squadron's mascot, a dog that everybody loves, that is your good luck charm, is on board with you, that when you're still in the shallows of the ocean, just coming onto shore, that you would let that dog drop from the plane to give it the best ever chance of survival, knowing that if he stayed on board, he might not? Now, I know that that theory is slightly out there, but it's possible, right? The plane's not been found, the crew's not been found, but the dog was found. I know that this theory is wildly out there, but just think about it. During World War II, our coastlines were so heavily fortified. We had people all over the place watching for enemy invasions. Had that plane gone down within a dog's swimming distance, it would have been seen. Somebody would have seen it. So isn't it more likely it came home, it got across Lincolnshire, back into Yorkshire, to possibly disappear on the Peat Moors? So for me, the conclusion seems quite obvious, and I must say I've spoken to several historians about this, and they do agree with me as well. You've got 1 plane lost at sea out of a whole squadron full of people. There are only 5 men unaccounted for, and you absolutely have the fact that the rear gunner can rotate and fall out of the plane in a very similar way to what would have happened to the body in the bog. I believe wholeheartedly that the airman in Finningley churchyard is Stanislaw Gross. He was a young man, slight build, you might almost say feminine features as well. And he was the rear gunner on the second plane that Stanislaw Barstow was on that also crashed. I believe the second Wellington Bomber and 4 members of its crew are still out on Hatfield Moor. Now, this isn't just speculation. I also have this from a local man who actually grew up at Lindholme Hall, which was the manor house I mentioned earlier. He grew up there as a young boy and he vividly remembers 3 Wellington bomber crash sites. However, we only know in history about 2. So, where do we go from here? I believe the answer lies with the retired detective Andrew Greenslade. He's the only person who still holds a file on this particular case. First of all, though, I do want to point out that Andrew Greenslade did fight for this airman to get a Commonwealth war grave and to have a burial fitting for a hero. He was the one that was instrumental in making sure that the memory of whoever this young man was would live forever. However, I have since contacted him asking for copies of the photographs. Just of the skull, and I only want copies, not the originals, but unfortunately he has never responded to my requests. So why are these photos so important? Well, it's really quite straightforward. With modern technology and artificial intelligence, we can take a photograph of the skull and do facial reconstruction. It would be so easy and literally take a matter of hours to be able to put a facial reconstruction in place, and then we can run it alongside all of the known members of 305 Squadron. So identification would be as easy as half a day's work. And who would do this? Well, that is actually really, really interesting. So I contacted a lady who's a professor at Liverpool University. She worked on the amazing case of King Richard III, the body that was found in the car park in Leicester. She's the one that did the full facial reconstruction of King Richard III, and she has offered to help us with the identification of the gentleman that we believe is Stanislaw Gross. Now, the problem with that is the quality of the pictures that we have are not very good, and that is why we need detective or retired detective Greenslade on board, because he's the only one with the quality photographs. So now I have 2 questions out there. If there are any historians that are watching this video, and gosh, I thought I knew this story inside out, but there are still some things that I just don't know. So number 1, does anybody out there know the plane that Ciapek was on? That final crashed plane, the one where he was found, but nobody else was. Does anybody know exactly what plane that was? And does anybody know retired detective Andrew Greenslade from South Yorkshire Police? I don't want to harass the man, not in the slightest. I'm sure he did absolutely the best he possibly could with such an incredible story. But if anybody knows him and could maybe ask him for a copy just of the skull, just for facial reconstruction purposes, I'd be so very, very grateful. This really would unlock the whole case. To conclude my story, I did go to Newark Cemetery to pay my respects.